to welcome 40% of you that were 10%ers. What was interesting when we did our 50th survey, 40% of the class did feel that they were the 10%ers. And what were the 10%ers? It's an interesting sort of history that got us to this idea. We actually started with our class, and it was President Sawyer in his 1961 inaugural address talked about what he wanted to do, 10%. But I just to go back a little bit very quickly, back before the First World War, if you wanted to go to an elite school, if you had a family member or if a school counselor who the college respected said this is the person who should be going to the school, or if you went for an interview, you could get in. But with World War I, there was a realization that a college education was really worth something. And people started to go. There was no admissions at Williams before World War I. It was just basically it was decided who was coming. The prep schools would send their people, and some of the college counselors would say this is the person to come. But after World War I, they set up an admissions department. And really what the thought was, we want to create the all-around person. You can go back to Mark Hopkins and a lot. Mark Hopkins loved to take the students in. He didn't require them to go to school. There was not a whole lot that they needed to accomplish. And Baskin, Dean Baskin was the one who said, come on, Mark, we got to get them to really learn and to work hard, because what they were trying to do was develop gentlemen. After World War II, there was a real push to go to school. And the applications started coming in, and the admissions departments got really very active at that point. And again, they relied on counselors from the schools and started relying on some testing. But it wasn't until Sputnik happened that the idea that your academic standing in the community was really important. How you tested on the test scores. And with that testing and with the academic standards going up, how do you measure who's the right person to be in school? With the Sputnik, it was just, hey, what's the data? Show us the data. And if the person that's got good grades, did well on the SATs, and had some other extracurricular activities, that's great. But what was happening was you had more and more applications, and you were getting a qualified pool that was terrific. The concern in the 60s, which was really interesting in the start of the 60s, was, hey, if we're just taking the most qualified on paper, are we getting the best students? It was funny, I worked at a camp in the Adirondacks in the summertime, and I coached with the person who was head of Yale's admissions department. And he was getting a lot of flack because they were starting to turn away kids of Yale grads. And that was a really difficult thing. But he also had said, and it really was kind of fun to hear this, but I had two quotes that I wanted to just read to you. Here we go. Got it? Got it. Sorry. Here we are. This is the head of admissions at Yale. Sometimes I lie awake at night worrying about whether we've been kidding ourselves into taking a lot of brainy kids who are too egocentric to contribute much to society. And the head of Brown.
What year was that?
That was 1960.
Right off. In 1962, the Ford Foundation underwrote this 10-year study. It was an admissions experiment whereby Williams would admit 10% of each class from applicants who in some significant way could not meet the college's admissions requirements. And following on his theme, that the effort allowed the college to compensate for its restrictive selectivity that had been forced on the college, one by its reputation, and then by the burgeoning go-to-college population that bloomed in the late 50s and 60s. So, like you said, if we continued on the same route we did, our selectivity requirements at Williams would have made us this well-rounded series of classes. If you look at the Ford Foundation's annual report for 1962, Williams is listed along with 12 other schools receiving funds, quote, for comprehensive development of selected private liberal arts colleges to best advance their long-range objectives. The phrase 10% is nowhere connected, mentioned in Ford Foundation reports. Ours apparently was the first class of 10%ers. The Ford-funded program lasted through 1973. During that time, neither the students nor the professors knew who was a 10% based upon the admission requirements. I assume Fred Copeland and Phil Smith, they knew, but the students and the professors were not supposed to. There's not too much info that I could find, but I think Scott has come up with some, about what was the outcome of the program. Phil Smith was quoted, however, in the Alumni magazine in the 70s, stating that the program, that what it did is it brought in blue-collar minority students as well as those with particular academic or extracurricular strengths. And the results had, quote, striking results, okay? I assume that means we graduated. I also find it more than a coincidence that the 10% program started the same year fraternities were banned and we had more public school boys than private school boys. You know, you add up those facts, fraternities are gone, the majority are now public school boys being admitted, and the 10% program on top of that, one could reasonably ask, as Fred Rudolph did at the time, whether the concept of gentlemen at Williams died in 1963.
Raise your hand, jury.
Okay, now a personal story. I arrived by train from Kansas City, never having been east of the Mississippi, in September '63, along with Erwin Block. Now, Erwin and I went to kindergarten together, Kansas City. But then we played basketball against each other in Kansas City. I stayed in public, he went to private school. So we get back to Williams on the first day, and of course Erwin said, let's go shoot some baskets. So we find the gymnasium and some other people that are playing basketball. Maybe Gordy was there, I don't know. And at one point, Erwin yelled my name, Bodinson. And right when he did, somebody was walking by. And that gentleman stopped and said, Bodinson, where's Bodinson? And I said, here I am. And the varsity basketball coach's face fell. He said, I thought you were 6'5". I said, no, 5'6", and I get those numbers. So back at the St. George, roommates were already talking about the 10%ers. They're explaining how the 10% program, that some of the people in the class were admitted because they had special abilities. They could play the French horn better than anybody, or were big, tall people who could play sports. And right then I realized I was a 10%er, albeit a fraudulent one. So that was my experience.
Okay. Well, I can pick up on a couple of things that we talked about already. I think, well, I see a connection actually in three areas. You know, Ron was saying public high school acceptances started coming in at Williams at this time. I see a connection between the elimination of fraternities, minority enrollment, more reflecting the American population and the ambition of women. I think all three of these are connected. I think they were connected to President Sawyer's mind. And I felt a little, as I thought about this, I felt like, do you remember that when we had, who was responsible for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that thing we did using the original papers when we were in history freshman year? I don't know if you remember that, but it was a thing that we had to do in one of the history classes. And I kind of felt like as I was reading these things and I was thinking, I don't think that some of the things that were being stated were actually what was happening here. I think there was more going on. I think about the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation, they really care about, giving an opportunity to these white people that, somehow didn't have good grades, but let's look at some other things and see if they can get these elite institutions. I don't know. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. I think that I remember Professor Burns in a senior political science major class saying that he thought fraternities at Williams hobbled people for life. And I thought, wow, that was a pretty strong statement, to hear from the great James Burns. And I thought about, just the connection of getting rid, what's going to happen with elimination of fraternities. I think that what was seen by people like Sawyer and Burns was you couldn't really ever eliminate, if you didn't eliminate fraternities, you couldn't bring in minorities, you couldn't bring in women, because they would be second-class citizens in this environment. In fact, we heard just a couple of us were sitting in a presentation just a few minutes ago, and they were talking about Williams under Baxter. They were suggesting that, public high school people were not accepted interviews saying you're accepted. You need a promise you won't apply anywhere else. I mean, I was not in the top 5% of my high school class in 500. I think everybody else had ever been accepted to Williams. My high school was in the top 5%. And so I had other things going for me, but still, I think I would well qualify. I fit under a few of these categories. So that's my own personal view. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm sure I was at 10%.
Speak up loudly, Rick. Speak up loud.
So yeah, I was at 10%. But to me, it's all about diversity. I became principal of my first school in Kansas City, Notre Dame de Sion. I was probably the only person they could find who would take the job because the school was failing. The enrollment had been plummeting. It was down to 210 and needed to be up around 300. And over 38% of the students were people of color, most of them Black. And the school was in a part of Kansas City that the real estate agents like to call a little salt and pepper. So it looked pretty bleak. I did not have an idea that because a third were Black, we were in trouble from an academic standpoint or an achievement standpoint. That never occurred to me. And that's a good thing that it didn't occur to me. A board member said to me, research shows, he didn't want anyone else to hear this. Research shows that if a school goes a third Black, it goes all Black. But we made diversity a virtue. We said diversity is essential for excellent education because kids need to be associated with all different kinds of people because that's where at least 50% of their brain gets developed. And so that was the critical thing for me. And sure enough, 8 years later, it was the hot school in town, and it was still a third Black. So we showed that actually even Kansas Cityans are not that prejudiced. In fact, they would say, well, I just don't want my kid to be an experiment. Well, when it wasn't an experiment and their kids were being successful and they were being accepted at the best high schools, well, I don't mind my kid being associated with a Black kid. And I was really proud of that. And that ended up being sort of the keystone of my entire career. I went to another school. And then my third school in Oakland, California, I was there for 12 years. It had a majority of minorities, and everybody loved it that way. They were proud of that. We were beating the top schools in town. When I came, again, it was on the ropes. It had a $500,000 deficit, and the top schools in town, we were sort of a second-rate school. But when we became diverse, everybody wanted to come, and we were beating the competition hand over fist. In fact, they all changed. Now you go to any school, any private school in Kansas City, and you say, well, what's your diversity? Oh yeah, well, diversity is top of the list for us. So I'm not sure that the concept started here at Williams. I'm not sure where it started. It seemed a good idea at the time to me. And I still believe in that. But it comes to a crunch, really. I don't know, does anybody know Lowell High School in San Francisco? Have you heard about it? Okay, 2 people. Well, it's the top school to go to, and you have to have high test scores to get in and high grades, and at least 40%, if not 60%, are Asian. Right? You were shaking your head.
Yeah. Oh, it's not at the top anymore, but yeah.
Well, not at the top anymore.
Too many
because-
Asians.
No, not too many Asians.
They
No,
haven't
they decided there's not enough diversity. It's too many Asians.
Yeah.
And so we got to do something about that. So they said we're going to do it by a lottery system. And that is very controversial. Now, some of you may have read an article in the New Yorker about it.
Yeah.
It's a really good article in the New Yorker about it. And it's an article that sort of damns the idea a little bit. It's not very clear about that. But I think it's a dilemma these days. I don't think there's an easy answer to how to do it. But I'll end with my proudest moment of all was at my fourth school, which is Children's Day School in San Francisco. A father of a girl who had come as a 3-year-old she was now a 4-year-old, and he was one of the parents who volunteered to be on to do the mission tours, and we were standing out in front waiting for the thing to start, and I said, well, why did you send Helen here? And he said, oh, that's easy. I visited 16 schools in town, and all other schools like this school goes like that. And I think that's what Williams does. I'm not exactly sure how they did it, but it does seem like that's what they do. I think that's what all schools should do. And it's a little tricky. I heard the director of admission, the former director of admission, what's his name?
Tom Parker.
Yeah, we heard it on Zoom. I didn't hear. I was disappointed to hear, but I wanted to hear from him. It sounded to me like there's still test scores and grades still really important. And when you're supposed to be the top college in the country, and you only need to accept 8% of everybody who applies, well, of course you're going to get 800 board scores and A's and everything. So I wasn't sure from that talk where the college is right now. That doesn't mean I think the college is failing. It's just that I don't know. I'm just curious as to how it really goes on in the admission department.
Scott, you had asked a question.
Speak loud.
Scott, you had asked a question earlier, and I think we'll start with that. But it was interesting when Tom talked. When we were admitted as a class, there were 1,500 applicants for 300 positions. Presently, there are 15,000 applicants for 600 positions. And Tom was a little discouraged about that. He just said, how do we handle this now? We used to be able to talk about all our candidates. And now it's really hard because all our candidates are very qualified. And so Scott, you asked your question, I think.
If only we knew what Bill Smith's standards were, we'd be on the road to something.
He's here, we should have invited him.
Well, I can tell you one of the, I don't know, I'm sorry, but if you haven't talked, if you see Phil, say hello, and he will tell you everything there is to know about your record when you apply. He has a early, he's a savant when it comes to admissions. Yes, absolutely. So,
One additional fact is that, so
Speak loudly.
was quoted, 348 people came through the 10% over that
okay.
10 years, which makes sense because
Yeah.
the classes of 300 or so, 30-some class. So the figure was between 300 and 350.
Another figure related to that I thought was very interesting is that group, the 10% group, had a 75% graduation rate, which they said was 12 to 15 points below the standard graduation rate in college. I was actually surprised that the graduation rate with the college wasn't higher than 85%.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't, but that was data where that was cited, the article may have been incorrect. That's what the New York Times article said.
Was that for the Ford Foundation or for?
Well, they said the Ford Foundation group, they said was 75%, which they thought was fantastic. And it didn't sound like that was great to me at Williams College, because I think it's kind of hard to flunk out of Williams College, you know. And then, but they said the Williams College graduation rate was 12 to 15 points above that. So it was like 85 to 86%. I think that's just wrong.
Sometimes they talk about graduation rate. A lot of the statistics we see are 5 years.
Oh.
So when you're looking, people take a gap year, people go on for the semester and come back and finish.
Yeah, I don't know.
And people don't just leave because they flunk out. They may leave because they don't feel it's a good fit and they transfer.
That's fair. I interpret it the wrong way.
And we had students leave because they had an illness in the family and they have to go home and take care of someone. So it's not all academic. Sometimes it's circumstances for it.
And we were the turbulent 60s, so there were the draft, the war, all kinds of things.
Yeah, we had a 4-year window for undergraduate 2 years, for undergraduate 2F, we had 4 years.
What were you going to say?
So a couple of things. One, Williams did not know that I played football. So I thought that was a good thing.
They found out it was true, Ed. Sorry.
But this whole program is shrouded in mystery.
Yes.
So we don't know. We know when it started, when it finished. What were the criteria? What are the data? 50 years later,
We don't know, and I mean, personally, I don't want anybody to think that I'm sitting here thinking that it's a bad outcome, because I think it was great things happened, because I think today, I don't know how many of you would agree with, I'd love to see a show of hands, how many of you think it would be better to be a student at Williams today than it would have been a student when we went? And to me, there would be no.
Just a follow up to Bob's comment. We were at dinner for people who were accepted to.
Look up, speak up, project.
Bob and I were at dinner for people accepted to Williams College. And I was the 5th person to stand up saying, I'm Peter Krause from, and that was the 5th person to say that. I was the 5th person to say that I go to Manhasset High School in Manhasset, New York. And it was very funny because, well, there were 5 people and all coming from the same town. And that comment is neither here nor there. It's just interesting. My real question though is, what criteria would they use to determine whether the 10% plan was successful? What were the objectives? What criteria were used for admission at that time? And how did these people differ? And so I'd be very curious to know the answer to those questions. And I also find it difficult to understand why that information is not available.
Yeah,
I agree.
So I'm puzzled because it'd be nice if we had Phil Smith here, But I seem to remember 30 years ago or more, that at a reunion, he or somebody talked about the 10% plan. And he said, look, some of the results were predictable. The people who were class leaders in high school turned out to be class leaders at Williams. The people who were really good at a particular subject, didn't have the whole thing, continue to be particularly good in that subject. So I think some of the criteria, clearly they did look at the results, and I'm surprised that, not by name, but just overall, that wasn't made available to the school. I know there was a discussion of it at some point when we were back here.
It was at the 25th reunion that Phil Smith said that, but I don't remember. I mean, it was vague statements. I mean, he didn't say anything that was concrete or that had statistical analysis.
We ought to march on his house, right?
Hey, you guys are missing something. The way we have 10% going on. When I came here, just before I came here, Williams College was a monopoly in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and New York. I lived in California. If you're in California and you can talk.
If you recall,
Michigan, from Idaho, so there's no Idaho. He was the only one who's ever applied from Idaho up until that time. He was in. So you have this big movement that's going on. Williams is trying to go from a small little parochial school in New England to have a big. I figured in our class there were 6 of us that came from Southern California, which is key. Fred Copeland came out and all of us.
Yeah,
But that was going on at the same time. We're going through this 10%. We're going through this fraternity.
that's true. Yeah.
We're going through women, whatever. But there's a lot of things going on, and I'd be surprised if Ford Foundation has ever figured out what was the results of the 10%.
Too many variables.
A question.
Yeah.
This process, when the term tracking us, just the 4 years we were at Williams, or over the entire 10-year period? And if it's the latter, how did they track us after we graduated? I'm just worried about statistically flawless. How do they track all that? I mean, anybody know?
Well, everything I've seen is just what we did at Williams, not anything afterwards. So when he's saying 348 went through there, with blue collar, they had striking results, and graduated this, they weren't talking about. Williams had no idea where I was 6 years after I graduated.
So, yeah, it was very frustrating. Because the data is important.
Yeah.
They'd like to know what criteria to use. If it's really successful, why wouldn't it be disseminated? And it's published, absolutely published. So it really should be out there. I mean, not just where it should be.
And I know I'm trying to find the report.